This is Pastoring in the Digital Parish, your resource and connection for ministry in the digital realm. Hi, my name is Ryan Dunn. I'm the host of this podcast. This episode is wrapping up some of the learnings of Season 3, which culminates into a realization that, dare I say, is actually nothing new. That's right. We learned a lot of new stuff during Season 3, as we have through all of our previous seasons on Pastoring in the Digital Parish. But what has really been enlightening is the way that recent events have accelerated a shift in ministry that's really been in motion for decades. So in this session, we're going to talk about what that shift is, why we've been a bit slow in the church to adapt, and what the shift means for the future role of the minister, especially the minister who's trying to connect communities in digital space. Whether our primary area of ministry is digitally based or not, we're all admitting that there has been a shift towards a more digitally based center of faith, connection, and formation. And the shift into a more digitally based ministry is actually reflective of something else. It's reflective of a shift that's been happening in the church for quite a long time. One that when I first entered professional ministry 20-something years ago, we were already aware of, but struggling in figuring out how to adapt. In order to describe this shift, we're going to look at how our TV viewing or our TV consuming habits have changed over the past several decades. So let's go back to 40 plus years ago when our TVs weighed like 100 pounds because they were all tubes and glass, and we had to twist dials to tune into our TV channels, and half the clicks on those dials were nothing but static and white noise. And really, we only had 3 to 4 choices for original content. There were the 3 major networks. There were CBS, NBC, ABC, and we might have a local option or something on the UHF band. But most of the stuff on the UHF band was a reproduction of shows that had already aired on one of the big 3 networks. So that's where you could catch your reruns of The Brady Bunch or The Courtship of Eddie's Father. I don't know. So we just had our 3 to 4 channels who were set up for synchronous consumption, meaning that we had to tune in at a specific time on a specific device in order to receive that content. If the show we wanted to watch was Different Strokes, then we had to wait until 7 p.m. on Saturday and turn on NBC in order to catch that show. If we missed it, then we had to wait until the following week to catch it. And who knows when we were going to be able to catch that actual episode that we weren't able to view. Because, again, we weren't in a specific place at a specific time. In the 1980s, things started to change a little bit. Cable broadcast began to take over, and this meant that instead of counting on aerial receivers to catch our broadcasts, we had stations piped right into our TV sets through a coaxial cable. We still needed to watch at specific times and on specific devices, but we had a lot more choice. There were a lot more cable stations, and some of them started to get very specialized. So, for example, my parents could watch news whenever they wanted on the All News channel, and I could sing along to Aha's Take on Me nearly all day, every day, thanks to the All Music video station, which is what NTV used to be. Audiences then were becoming much more niche. About this time, VCRs became household items as well. So we were a little less time-bound and a little less device-specific because our content became somewhat portable in the form of those VCR tapes. As long as we could figure out how to program our VCRs to not only display the correct time, but then to turn on the record function at the designated time. And hopefully we had a tape that was appropriate and we weren't taping over our sister's piano recital. Anyways, even up to this point, though, TV engagement was tied mostly to time and place. If you're of a certain, shall we say, distinguished age, you'll remember NBC's must-see TV. That was their description of Thursday night programming for most of the 80s and into the 90s. And I'll bet you can even name the NBC Thursday night must-see TV lineup from its heyday in the mid to late 80s. You kick things off with The Cosby Show, right? And then following that, any guesses? Mid to late 80s, it was followed by Family Ties, And then you had Cheers, which was on forever. In my mind's eye, I'm seeing Night Court coming on next, but that 8:30 hour, if you were in the Central Time Zone, 9:30 elsewhere, Eastern Time Zone, that changed around a little bit. And then you got to the drama hour, shifting gears to a long-standing drama like Hill Street Blues. Later it became LA Law, and then eventually ER took over. If you were to watch these shows, your rear was on the couch at the primetime hour. Now, today, I wonder if primetime is even really still a thing. Like, I'm struggling to name any big primetime shows right now. I feel like Big Bang Theory may have been the last of its kind. I suppose there's Young Sheldon, but what else is really carrying the primetime hours? I don't know, honestly, because my TV viewing habits have wildly changed, much like yours, I'm sure. Anyways, continuing our timeline here. In the 2000s came streaming, and things got a little bit crazy because we now had the power to decide the what, the when, and the where of TV consumption. TV is not something that happens in a specific place at a specific time now. TV is relative to the individual. It's free of the bonds of time or location. I will decide what I want to watch, thank you very much, when I want to watch it, and where I want to watch it. Now, church, here's our jump. Church is not TV. It is not something we consume in the way that we consume TV content. Church is community, right? It's people. And we've been reminding ourselves of this fact in church world for a long time. But there have been aspects of our communal operation in which we behave much like the TV programmers of old. In this mindset, we're very bound by time and space. The central practices of our community draw people into connection at a specific time and in a specific place. In many churches, let's face it, that central community program is a weekend worship service. Now, sometimes we hear churches claiming it's a small group gathering, but by and large, however, it still boils down to the worship event for most faith communities. And we've been doing it this way for decades, right? Of course, then pandemic hit. And one of the crises we faced in the church was a crisis of model. Since we often modeled our community life into drawing people together in time and space, we had the must-see TV primetime television model. But it's like a cat burglar, which in this case would be COVID, stole all the TV sets and couches out of everyone's houses. Our ability to observe time and space together was gone, right? And we sought a new model in its place. And this new model was really a model that we were well aware of and had been slowly wandering towards for several years. I talked about a shift that we noticed in church practice about 20 years ago without specifically mentioning what that shift was. At the time, in the churches I worked in, we were becoming aware that our community life in church was very much driven by programs. We hosted a program-driven ministry, and that means that when we thought about what we did as a faith community, we thought in terms of events and programs. If we wanted to do evangelism, for example, we would put on an event that we would invite people to. If we were trying to get people into small groups, then we would do a kickoff event to engage people in those small groups. If we were focusing on discipleship or accountability, then the ministry leaders would devise a program that usually involved drawing people together in specific places at specific times. This probably sounds familiar. The shift that we were aware of, but not sure how to adapt to, was a shift from a program focus to a relationship focus. We knew people were hungering for the relationship without the program. But in our churches, we were designed to focus on programming. So we struggled with how to facilitate relationships in our communities without leaning more into the programming. And some new ideas came out of this whole movement. Movements like dinner church and many fresh expressions models. Small groups were becoming increasingly important. Anything that displaced really the center of church community from the sanctuary or classroom into another location, like a home or coffee shop or, say, gym, they all captured our imagination. So this was one of the big shifts we were facing when the pandemic hit. People longed for more relationships, but less programming. And then, of course, the pandemic took away our programming. We were no longer about being in a specific time and place. And this was fascinating to me. Even when we did events online during the pandemic, these events were often assembled asynchronously. In our worship experiences, for example, the pastor recorded a sermon segment. The worship leader recorded special music. An exhorter or announcements person recorded a welcoming segment. Then someone assembled all these independently produced segments into a unified experience. But it was months before we saw most churches try to do a live experience. Instead, the worship experience said, hey, we're going to be welcomed into our lay leader's living room, and she's going to provide a lens or mindset for how we can engage with the content which is about to be presented. And then we shifted to the music director's spare bedroom, where we were invited to engage with song and contemplate. And then we jumped into the children director's kitchen table for a scripture reading. And then it was on to the senior pastor's home office for a reflective sermon. We were ushered from virtual space to virtual space for standalone pieces of content. I think that's fascinating because often the center of religious experience was relocated from formal space into personal living space. And that's a telling aspect about the future of ministry. It's also telling, though, that these different elements of worship came across time. They were not privileged to a specific time. Really, that means that people were sharing the same experience no matter what time they engaged with the content that was presented. The fact that these elements were so often pre-recorded lent towards that feeling of displaced time. No one was sharing in a live experience, so no one was missing out on the live experience. Just as streaming has displaced the must-see TV primetime viewing, the network TV model of content distribution and engagement mirrored in our churches was effectively killed by the COVID experience. And now, as we've eased away from quarantines and social distancing, we're still finding that people are not warm to the older models of programming that are tied to specific place and time. In TV viewing, as people have been exposed to the freedom of streaming, they have no urge to retreat back to the days of Thursday night must-see TV. And as our post-pandemic participation numbers in programs have not neared our pre-pandemic numbers, we're witnessing that people are unwilling to go back to a program-centric model of faith community. This doesn't mean that they're not spiritually hungry. As people of faith, we know that there's a divinely imprinted hunger there, right? But we are seeing that people are looking for different ways to engage spiritually, something that exists outside of a programmatic model. Okay, so what then is the new model? Well, one might say it's all of it. It's asynchronous events and programs. It's relationships fostered outside of time. It's both and. Or we might say that we don't know because we're still figuring it out. I think one thing we infer is that new models will be somewhat individually tailored, and that one faith community does not encompass one's entire faith experience. So NBC dominated Thursday nights in the 80s. You watch the whole slate of shows on one channel, but today's Thursday night viewer is going to catch their latest episode on HBO Max, then cruise to see what's new on Netflix and watch part of an episode that night, and then put the rest of it on pause for the next night. Okay, I think my television analogy is starting to break down, but you get the final idea. There's a lot more consumer choice in today's digitally driven marketplace of spiritual ideas. And this is where I'd like us to remember back to the conversation that we had with Dr. Jeffrey Mann during this season of pastoring in the Digital Parish. Dr. Mahan shared with us a rising model through which people are creating or forming personal meaning. Our new models of meaning making mirror our space of widened consumer possibilities. So an individual is much less likely today to ascribe to one singular system of meaning making. Instead, they're much more likely to take bits and pieces of many systems and integrate that into something that makes sense to them. So, for example, it's not uncommon to find a Christian who often engages in Buddhist meditation practices, or another one who loves the writings of Rumi and peruses them regularly for meaning making, or a parishioner who's a Methodist because they find meaning in all these various traditions. This suggests that ministers in the new ministry landscape are becoming more mentor/guides than they are as direct conduits for traditional meaning. Dr. Mahan suggested that ministers will do well to shift from a mindset of saying, I'm going to help you be Methodist or Baptist or Lutheran, to adapting a mindset that says, look, I'm influenced by Methodist thought, or Episcopalian, Anabaptist, Latvian Orthodox, whatever your tradition is. I'm influenced by this tradition, and here's a resource that has been meaningful in my own meaning making. So we as ministers become witnesses to our own faith journeys of formation, or our own journeys of faith formation. In a big sense, we are influencers. And if we think about what social media influencers do, well, they act as living advertisements, for lack of a better word, for the items and ideas that impact them. The ministerial role of the future is to be an influencer for the sake of Christ by bearing witness to the items, the content, practices, and ideas that influence our spiritual lives. Of course, we do this most openly by embracing the opportunities of being present and available to people through digital spaces. And that means that the future minister will be a digital storyteller, willing to share their own faith experiences on digital media. And that's where our conversations with Reverend Nicole Riley and Chris Wilterdink and Nathan Webb become important, because they all touched base on aspects of being a ministerial presence in digital space. Once upon a time, it was the role of a communications person to represent our faith community online. And this communications person might have built a church website and created a church Facebook page, and then populated those spaces with communications about the church. If we're going to lean into the new model of meaning making and recognize that a lot of that meaning is created through digital means, then it's imperative that we view digital space not just as a communications venue, but as a ministry area. And that means that we'll entertain ideas of how we extend ourselves as pastoral presences in digital space. Chris and Nathan specifically helped us recognize ways that we can do that responsibly and with boundaries, as Nathan shared his online ministry guides for safe boundaries, and Chris shared how we safely relate to youth in digital space. And Nicole Riley talked about being that pastoral presence, even when you're the senior pastor or solo pastor of a church. And this is a pressure point, because we can easily let this devolve into a situation where we're being pulled apart into a multi-campus ministry, where we have the in-person congregation that we have to look after and the digital congregation. In some ways, we can sidestep this a little bit by allowing the digital area to be the way in which we spend time in our congregation. So it becomes the third space, replacing the coffee shop where we used to hang out in order to meet parishioners in the community. It's also the space where we can meet a whole different group of people that we might never connect with through programmatic ministry. We heard at least 2 tales of that happening this past season. In both cases, pastors started doing a form of ministry online because it was something through which they could express their own creative passions. One of those pastors was Brad Larvick, and Brad has built a ministry reaching thousands of people now through TikTok. He has a passion for puppetry and obviously a talent for pastoral care. So he utilizes his puppets on a TikTok channel to speak words of pastoral care and encouragement. And people tune in by the thousands to his weekly live segments. And he's doing this as a creative expression of ministry, supported by his congregation, but not necessarily as an extension of his congregation. This is a niche ministry. It's a ministry built for a specific segment of people. In this case, young people on TikTok who are at risk, in crisis, or spiritually seeking. Another pastor expressing something new in digital space who we heard from is Mark Lutz of Lux Digital Church. And Mark started that community because he was building connections with gamers over digital meeting spaces. And he was doing this while he was running ministry in a local church. So these pastors were both working in a bit of a split campus scenario, but in a way that was life-giving to them. Partially because they were creatively expressing themselves and ministering to a segment or demographic that was not a part of their traditional church demographic. And that's a witness that many of the communities built in digital space are, in fact, niche communities, meaning they're very specific in regards to what they're about. And this builds on some ideas we've come across in previous seasons. We heard this idea that well-articulated boundaries led to intimacy in online groups. And we also heard that a clear articulation of values and mission really served as a campfire around which people are willing to connect. Specifically, I'm thinking of our session with Stephen Adair last season, where he shared about the growth of his congregation, Glendale United Methodist Church. And Glendale's social media presence dares to speak on some controversial subjects. And yes, that turns some people off, but it also connects heavily with like-minded folks who are willing to say, this is my kind of community. Our digital communities are not going to be as broadly connected as our in-person communities formerly were. They're going to be much more interest-based. This is for better or for worse, but it's a reality of the user choice, consumer-driven aspect of digital space. Our online communities are not going to be all things for all people. And that said, the church is for all people, but our online expressions in ministry are going to be more niche than the church universal. To connect with people online, we'll need to take the step to be definite about who we're trying to reach and what our boundaries are. And it seems the more focused we are, the more likely we are to connect with our target community. So define your niche, whether it be as Jane Austen fans or opponents of capital punishment, or Jane Austen fans who oppose capital punishment. Drill down to your niche. Everyone's welcome, but you're not trying to reach everyone online because honestly, you simply can't do it. So that wraps up my big learnings from season 3. They all really have to do with the future role of the minister, especially as it relates to digital space. First, we're going to assume the role of mentor guides and influencers, offering testimonies of the practices and ideas that help us make our own meaning. Secondly, digital presence is going to be less about communications and more about pastoral presence. And thirdly, the future is niche. What about you? Did you have an aha moment in this season of pastoring in the Digital Parish? Where we're walking away on our Facebook page, Pastoring in the Digital Parish. I don't know what I'm saying to close us out. I'll say it anyway. Shying away from this season, we're going to take on me a little break over the next several weeks. I'll be gone to an annual conference or two through the summer months. So needless to say, we'll revamp and get to work on season 4 of Pastoring in the Digital Parish, but I'll be stumbling away and waiting for your feedback, questions, and ideas on our Facebook group. Extra points if you include the lyrics to Aha's Take on Me, as I've just been doing. I'm so sorry. Slowly learning that life is okay. Comment away knowing it's not better to be safe than sorry. Thanks to Resource UMC for making all this possible. I'm Ryan Dunn. It's my pleasure to share this time with you, and I'm so grateful that I get to explore all these topics. I'll be coming for you anyway, in another season, in a couple months. In the meantime, I'll be gone. I'll show myself out. Bye.